Okay, we're on DAF Lamed Ches Amud Aleph on the 7th line. We were dealing with issues of inheritance yesterday. We're just going to continue that until the Mishnah. We talked about yesterday the idea of Maman Amutal B'Safek, that if neither person is what we call a muchzak, has the advantage of possession, and you don't know who the money belongs to, we basically say Cholkin, we divide it. And that's why we talked about a situation where you have this kid who's the Safek, really, right? Because what happened was Reuven died. His brother Shimon does Yibum prematurely before waiting to determine whether Reuven's widow is pregnant or not. And then 7 months later, she has the baby. We're not sure if that child is Reuven's child or Shimon's child. And then when it comes to dividing Reuven's estate, this kid, Safek, we'll call him, he says, I'm Reuven's son, so I'm entitled to the estate. Shimon says, no, you're my son. I get the estate. You get nothing until I die. So the Gemara had said that in that case, Yachloku, they divide the estate. And then we had a number of different permutations of that discussion that ensued. And we're continuing along with those, with that same idea. Safek v'yavim shabo lachzok b'nichsei saba. That's why in line 7 we have the case now where Reuven dies, Shimon does Yibum, and now Yaakov, who's Reuven and Shimon's father, he passes away. Now, it's important to know that if a man dies without children, if a man dies with a child, and then his father passes away, so the father's, the grandfather's assets go to the grandson, because the grandson sort of takes his father, is a surrogate for his deceased father, as far as being an heir. So if, let's say, a man dies and he has 2 sons, Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven had died before Yaakov, the grandfather died, and Reuven had left over a son, so then Reuven's son gets half, and Shimon gets half. So here's the argument. Safek Amar Hai Gavra Bar Mesanahu Upal Gedidihu, Yavam Amar At Barai Didi At V'Leslach V'Lomidi. So the Safek kid says, I'm Reuven's son, and therefore I get half of the Yerusha from my grandfather Yaakov. And Shimon says, you get nothing because you're my son, and I'm therefore the only surviving heir, and therefore I get the whole thing. So Haviyavam uvadai safek, Haviyavam vadai the safek safek, vein safek motzi midei vadai. So the Gemara says that in that situation, it's not a case of where both of them are equally safek. Here, Shimon rather has the advantage because Shimon is a muchzak. He knows exactly that he is an heir. He knows exactly that he's entitled to certainly no less than half. And based upon that, it's not that we're not sure whether Shimon is entitled to anything at all, like in our previous case where we're not sure if Shimon fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum or not. Here, the argument is that Shimon is for sure an heir of Yaakov. So he's considered to be a vadai. Safek, this kid whose name is Safek, we don't know what his status is. We don't know if he's Reuven's son or he's Shimon's son. If he's Reuven's son, he's an heir. If he's Shimon's son, he's not an heir. And therefore, he's a Safek. And ein Safek motzi midei vada. You don't have a case where a Safek can extract property from a vadai. And therefore, since Shimon is in a stronger position, Shimon is assumed to take everything until Safek can prove that he's Reuven's son. And we're going to have this discussion of Ein Safek Motzi Midei Vadai ensuing as we go on to the next Mishnah. Let's go on to the next case first. Safek uvnei yafim shabo lachluk b'nichsei saba. Next permutation is where you have this kid Safek and then the heirs of Shimon. So what happened was Reuven died, Shimon did Yibum. They have the woman has a child after 7 months, and then Shimon dies. Now Shimon had left over. Shimon had previously had 2 other children from his regular wife. So now you've got these 3 surviving children. Shimon's 2 children from his previous marriage, and then this kid who's Safek, we're not sure whether it's Shimon's son or whether it's Reuven's son. And then Yaakov, the grandfather, passes away. So now we have this other dilemma. We don't know whether Safek is one of 3 children of Shimon, in which case he'd be entitled to a third of the estate, or whether he's Reuven's son, in which case he'd be entitled to half of the estate, because you divide between Reuven and Shimon. So just imagine, the Gemara is going to tell us, imagine a pizza pie with 6 slices. Okay, that's what we're going to do. So let's look at it this way. So Amar Hahu Gavra Bar Mesanahu Palgadidihu. So the Safek kid says, I'm Reuven's son, and therefore I'm entitled to half of the estate, because Yaakov, when he died, has two families that he has to provide for, Reuven's family and Shimon's family. I'm Reuven's heir, so I get half, and Shimon's two sons each get a quarter. Uvnei Yavam Amri Achona At Umanasa Islach Bahadan. So, and the Shimon's two sons say, no, you're our brother, you're Shimon's son, and therefore you only get a third of the estate, like us, not half. So, Palga de Kamodi Lihu Shakli. So the way you look at it is like this. You got this pizza pie in six slices, okay? They are Safek admits that the two sons of Shimon are entitled to half of the estate. That much he says you're entitled to. So therefore take 3 slices and give it to them, okay? Tilsa de kamo dule shakal. They admit to him that he's entitled to no less than a third, right? So give him 2 slices. What are you left with? You got 1 slice left of the pizza. Pashluhu danka, that's 1/6 of the estate. Havimamana mutal besafek v'cholkin, and on that 6th slice is what there's a dispute about over. So they divide it. Shimon's 2 sons get half of the slice, and Safek gets the other half of the slice. Next case.
They do it half, not third, a third, a third.
No, they do a half because that's the machlokas. It's a Safek.
So he gets an extra 12th.
Right. So each one, right? Each of Shimon's sons gets a 12th, and right. Okay. Now, Saba v'Yavam b'nichsei Safek, or Saba v'Safek b'nichsei Yavam. Next 2 permutations are, let's say, Safek dies, and he's the only child in the family. Okay, the Safek kid, and now you've got Shimon who's alive, and you've got Yaakov who's alive. So the question now is like this: who is the closest heir to Safek's assets? Is it Shimon who claims he's the father, or is it Saba Yaakov who says, Shimon, you're not an heir, you're his uncle, because Reuven is his father. I, therefore, his grandfather, am his closest heir. And therefore, that would be one machloikes, right? Or Osaba v'Safek b'nichsei Yavam. Or the other permutation is where Shimon dies, leaves over Safek and leaves over Saba. So Saba says, listen, Safek, you're Reuven's son, you're not Shimon's son, you're his nephew, and therefore you're not an heir, you don't get anything. I, as his father, am the closest heir, and I get his estate. And the Safek kid says, no, I'm Shimon's son, and therefore I get the estate. So in both of those cases, once again, Havimamana mutal b'Safek v'Cholkin, there too, neither one can really stake a claim clearly that he's an heir, and therefore it's a case of Mamana mutal b'Safek. Both of them have an equal shaky ground, and therefore they divide the estate.
It's not more on the kid, on Suffolk, to bring a raya for who he is. How come it's not on him? He has to, in other words, he has to prove it, who he is.
But the father has to prove that his son died without children. It's an equal suffix. Both of them are claiming that they're the closer heir. Okay.
In today's age with DNA testing, would that resolve some of these issues?
Possibly. I don't know. I don't know enough about DNA to tell you whether a nephew cannot be verified. I don't know. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Shomeres Yavam Shenaflu La Nechasim. So now let's go on to the next case. We've got a Yevama, and she's waiting. She's a lady in waiting. She's waiting to do Yibum. Okay? And in this case, and then while she's waiting to do Yibum, she inherits an estate. Now, let's clarify. When a woman is married and she inherits an estate, that's called nichsi milug. Everything that's real estate basically has her name on the title. But while she's married, the husband has control over the operation and over the fruits, over the dividends, all earnings that come from the estate. And also, he can prevent her from selling the real estate while they're married. Now, in a situation where there's only zika, there's not marriage, we had said that zika is like a pseudo-marriage, right? So for these purposes, it's a bit of a gray area what controlling share she now has over her real estate. So in this situation, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree, Modem Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, Shomacheres v'nosenes v'kayim, that she has the ability, since she's not married yet, there's no yibum yet, she has a right to go ahead and sell the property at her will, and her sale is a valid sale. Mesa, Ma yasa b'ksuvasa u'b'nechasim hanichnasim v'yotzin ima. Now that's only true when she's alive. What happens if the Yevama, before she does Yibum, dies? And now Shimon has a claim, and he says, listen, I didn't get a chance to do Yibum, however, I was ready to do Yibum, and therefore, we know that there's a halacha that when a man does Yibum, the kasuva that the woman is entitled to does not come from the Yavam's estate, it comes from the decedent's estate, it comes from Ruvain's estate. So Shimon is claiming this woman had dibs on my deceased brother's estate for her ksuva, and since I am her yavam, I want to get her ksuva. And also, I also want to be able to stake a claim on her nichse milug, on all of her other real estate holdings that she has from her family, that her name is on the title, because I'm her yavam and there was zika. But on the other hand, her family is claiming that you never did yibum, and therefore everything, all of her holdings, both her ksuva and her real estate, should revert back to her family and her heirs from her family. So Beishamai omrim yachloku yoshei habalim yoshei ha'av. So Beishamai say that all of her assets are divided equally between the yavam in potentio, the one that was supposed to do yibum, and her family. Ubeisil omrim nechasim becheskasa. And Beisil will say, no, we put the properties all back on their original status. And what he means is, Kesuva becheskas yorshe habal, nechasim hanichnasim v'yotzim ima becheskas yorshe ha'av. That the Kesuva, which came from the Ruvain's estate, goes to Shimon, because Shimon says, that's my mishpacha. So therefore he's more of a muchzak, he's more of an attached, he has more of an attached claim because it's from his family. And the real estate that she brought from her family, that she inherited, goes back to her family. So Beis Hillel says you look at the chazaka, you look at where there's already signs of possession, and you push the properties in that direction. Not that they divide equally, but rather Shimon gets the value of her ksufa from Ruvain's estate, and the woman's family gets all of her other real estate holdings that she brought in as an inheritance.
How do we know he wasn't going to do chalitza?
Okay, hold on. It's confusing enough. So let's just hold on. Kansa harehi keishto lechol davar. Now, if he ends up marrying her, if he ends up doing actual yibum before she dies, then she's mamish like his wife, and therefore, if and when she dies, then he does collect her ksuva, of course, because he now takes over all of Ruvain's estate. And if she dies and she has other real estate holdings, he inherits all of her property. But provided, in other words, but let's remember that if he ends up divorcing her or he dies, then the ksuva comes from the decedent's estate and not from any of his money. So therefore, if he ends up divorcing her, he doesn't have to pay the ksuva from his own assets. He pays the ksuva from his brother Ruvain's assets. The Gemara now says, and we'll analyze that last line later, Maishna reisha de lo pligi, umaishna seifa de pligi. So the Gemara's question is, what's the difference between the reisha and the seifa? In the reisha, where the Yevama is still alive, we had said that both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that everything is within her purview. The real estate is within her purview, and she can sell and do with it whatever she wants, since Lamaisa, the Yavam, hasn't done Yibum yet. And yet in the Seifa, and that's Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree on that. Why then is it in the Seifa we have this machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, that if she dies, Beis Shammai say that he and the heirs, the wife's heirs, divided equally, and Beis Hillel says you put everything on its chazaka. So why is there a difference? Where in the first case everyone agrees, in the second case there's a machlokas. So Omar Ula. So Ula offers one explanation. Reisha denafla kishihi arusa, v'seifa denafla kishihi nesua. The answer is that the Reisha is a little bit contrived because it's not explicit in the Mishnah, but basically his suggestion is that we're talking about two different cases. The Reisha is talking about where this woman is a Yevama from Eirison, which means that when she married Reuven only gave her Kiddushin and they hadn't consummated the marriage. She never had Nisuin. And therefore when a woman, let's be very clear, when a woman only has Eirison, her husband does not control her estate. And therefore, when Reuven died and he was only the Arus, and she falls, now there's Zikas Erison, there's not Zikas Nisuin. And that's why Shimon does not have a control over her estate. But the Seifa is talking about where she was a full-fledged wife of Reuven. Therefore, when Reuven died, there's a full Zika to Shimon, and that's why there are more rights that Shimon has over her estate, and that's why there's a machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as far as how to divide it. Ukesavar ula zikas arusa osa safek arusa, zikas nesua osa safek nesua. Now, you also have to say that according to Ula, just because there's a zika, it doesn't make her mamish like an arusa in the Reisha, and you also have to say in the Seifa too that the zika doesn't make her mamish like a nesua, but like a safek in both cases. Now, how do I prove that? Zika sarusa osa safek arusa. I'll explain to you in each case. In the Reisha, the reason why she's like a safek arusa is the isal kadaitach vaday arusa modim beisil shemacheres venosenes vekayam question mark. Because if you're going to make her like a mamash, a vaday arusa, that she's like just like a woman who's had betrothal to a man, then how could you say that a woman has full rights to sell the real estate? Because we know that that's the subject of a machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Because v'hatna naflu lo nechasim mishenis arsa Beis Shammai omrim timkor Beis Hillel omrim lo simkor elu ve'elu modim shimachar v'nas nakayim. That Beis Hillel argues with Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel say that lechatchila, even though she only had erison with the man, she's not allowed to sell any of her real estate without getting her husband's consent. It's only b'di'evid that Beis Hillel agree that if b'di'evid she sold it, that the sale is valid. And yet our Mishnah says that this woman who has zikas erisin is even lechatchila allowed to sell her real estate. So ela shmami na zikas arusa asik safek arusa. So therefore, you must conclude that it's not that she's mamish like an arusa because there's zika, but rather it's like a safek arusa. It's a gray type of, a fuzzy type of arusa, a pseudo arusa, and therefore, when it's a real arusa, Beis Hillel hold lechatchila, she's not allowed to sell her estate, but if she does, it's sold. And when it's a fuzzy pseudo arusa, like through zika, then even Beis Hillel agree that even lechatchila she's allowed to sell her real estate. Now, zikas nesua osa safek nesua. And let's go to the Seifa also. You, Ula, had said that the Seifa, which talks about a division of the assets when she dies, is talking about where she was Reuven's full-fledged wife, and now there's zikas nisuin to Shimon. But that zika does not make her like a vaday nesua, it makes her like a safek nesua, and I'll prove it to you. Di'isal kadaitach vaday nesua, Beis Shammai omrim yachloku yorshei habalim yorshei ha'av, question mark. Because if you're going to say that she's mamish like a nesua, that she's mamish like Shimon's full-fledged wife, then how could Beis Shammai say that if she dies, that the Yavam and her family divide the estate equally? V'hatna naflu la nechasim mishenises elu ve'elu modim shimachar v'nasno shabal motzi miyad alakuchos. It's very clear that Beis Shammai agrees to Beis Hillel that if a woman is fully married, she's a full nesua, the husband can prevent the sale of property. So you see that the husband has full control over her property. So why would you ever argue that according to Beis Shammai there should be a division of the estate between the husband and her heirs? It's clear elishmami na zikas nesua osa safek nesua, and therefore it's clear that according to Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the way Ula's understanding it, the zika that she has from the previous marriage now to Shimon as a nesua is only makes her like a pseudo nesua, not a full-fledged nesua. It's like a safek, and therefore Shimon is only entitled to half of the estate, and her heirs are entitled to the other half. And it's not like Shimon is like a full husband where he would get the whole estate. Now, Amar le Rabba, adamiflagi begufa ula achar misa liflagu bechayeha ula peiros! Exclamation point. He's asking a question on Ula. You know, Ula, you're telling me that you're actually creating a division in our Mishnah that is non-explicit. You're saying that the first part is talking about a zika from Erisin, and the second part of the Mishnah is talking about a zika from Nisuan. Now, I validate that distinction. That's a good distinction. However, if that's the distinction that the Mishnah wants to make, then why did they change the case that in the Seifa she's dead? Let them talk about a case where she's still alive. And the Mishnah should have discussed a zika from Erisin when she's alive, versus a zikas of nisuin when she's alive. And you should have explained like this. When there's zikas erisin, it's like she's a safek arusa, and therefore she fully controls her estate and she can sell it at her whim. When there's a safek nisuin, like a zika from nisuin, then the halacha is that the husband completely controls the peiros. Or you could have said that according to Beis Shammai, the husband has half control over the peiros, and the heirs have half control over the peiros, and they have to divide the peiros, the dividends of the estate, even though she's still, her name is still on the title. That's the way you should have the Mishnah should have presented itself according to you, Ula. Why talk about now she's deceased in the Seifa? Talk about the division of assets when she's alive. Okay, that's the question that the Gemara is asking. So Ela Omar Rabba, so Rabba therefore concludes that I disagree with the way that you're interpreting the Mishnah. Idi v'idi denafla kishehi nesua. Both the Reisha and the Seifa are talking about where the Yevama is from Nisuin, and the Zika is a Zikas Nisuin, and the Zikas Nesua osa Safek Nesua, and everyone agrees that you look at her like a pseudo Nesua, like a Safek Nesua, and Reisha di'ihi kayama havala ihi vadai ve'inhu safek ve'in safek motzi midei vadai. So what's the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa? Why then in the Reisha does she have full control over her real estate, and in the Seifa it's a division of control between the Yavam and her heirs? The answer is very simple. When she's alive, she is the true possessor. She's the muchazak, the possessor and the controller of her estate. Her name is on the title, and therefore she's a vadai owner. The yavam is only like a safek, because he's got that fuzzy pseudo connection to it. And if that's the case, it's like a safek versus a vadai, and ein safek motzi midei vadai, like we just saw in Amud Aleph. He can't extract from her anything, and therefore she has full control over the estate. And Seifa, Demesa, and that's, by the way, that's agreed to by both Hillel and Shammai, as the Mishnah had said. But Seifa, Demesa, but the second case where she's deceased, there's really no one whose name, the name on the title is the name of the decedent. So no one who is still alive has their name on the title. Both of them are really claiming that they want to gain possession of the property. So they're both on equal footing. So halalu boin lirash v'halalu boin lirash v'yachloku. And that's why Beis Shammai say that since neither of you has solid ground to stand on, you're both like in that gray area where you're both vying for that piece of property. That's why Beis Shammai say you split it, and Beis Hillel say put it on back on the chazaka. So the ksuva goes to Shimon, and her estate goes back to her family. So Eisvei Abaye. So Abaye now is going to challenge this because Ula Beis Shammai ein safik motzi midei vadai ? Question mark. You mean to tell me that Beis Shammai agrees that in a case of where a suffix wants to extract from a vadai, the suffix doesn't have the power to do so? I'm going to show you that that's not true, because v'hatanan nafal habayis alavi al aviv alavi al morisha v'hayulav ksuvas ishu bal chov. Okay, let me just explain the case. A house collapses. Tragically, a father and a son are in the house at the same time. They both die. The son didn't have a penny to his name. The father had a nice estate. The son had creditors. Let's say he had a ksuva that he had to pay for. He had debts that he had to pay off. Now, if the son dies penniless, the creditors are out of luck. They can't collect. There are no heirs. He has no money. There's no one that they can collect from. However, if the father dies first, then the son has now hit pay dirt 5 seconds before he dies. So he now dies a rich man instead of dying penniless. So therefore you have this dispute. The question is, when the son died, did he have money or did he not have money? So the way it works is like this. So Yorshei ha'av omrim habein meis rishon ve'achar kach meis ha'av. So the heirs of the father, meaning that the father had other sons besides this pauper who the house fell upon, right? He had other sons, and they're saying, listen, our brother died before our father, and as a result, our brother died penniless, and the creditors are out of luck. They can't collect anything from our father's estate because our father's estate never transferred over to our brother. And the creditor says, what are you talking about? Maybe the father died first, and therefore the son inherited his portion of the estate, and we as his creditors are entitled to that portion. So Beishamai omrim yachloku, uBeisil omrim nechasim bechezkasim. So it's interesting because Beishamai over here say that whatever the disputed claim of the creditor is, he gets 50%. He divides the claim with the other heirs, with the other brothers. Basically, that he gets to split the claim with the heirs. Now, and Beis Hillel say, no, the brothers get to keep everything and the creditor gets nothing. Now, v'hahacha yorshei ha'avadai u'bal chob safik safik u'motzim idei vadai. The problem that I have is this is also a case of Safik and Vadai. The terms Safik and Vadai are being used by the Gemara in a much broader sense. Here, what we're saying basically is like this. The brothers are saying, we are heirs, no matter how you look at it. We're either heirs of our father or we're heirs of our brother. No matter what, we are heirs. And therefore, we are vadai, we are muchzakim, we are the possessors of the real estate with the assumption of possession. And how, therefore, can Beis Shammai say that this guy who's a safek, who has no legitimate knowledge that he is entitled to that real estate, it's only a safek, how can he come along and stake a claim and get at least half of his claim? So you see that Beis Shammai holds safek is motzi midei vadai, not like you were trying to argue that according to the ratio of our Mishnah, ain't safek motzi midei vadai, and that's why the woman can sell her real estate. So that's the kasha. So the Gemara's answer is kasavri Beis Shammai shtar ha'omed legabos kegavoi dami. The answer is that when it comes to a promissory note is different. Beis Shammai are of the opinion that once a creditor holds a promissory note, it's as if he's actually already collected on the debt. And therefore he is considered a possessor of the assets. And therefore it's not like he's a regular Suffolk guy, I'm not sure whether I have a dibs on the estate or not. His shtar is as if he's holding on to the estate as well, and therefore he has just as much right as a vadai as the brothers. Now, uminat temra, and how do you know that Beis Shammai holds that a promissory note has that potency? Ditnan mesu ba'alehen ad shelo shasu. Because we have a Mishnah in Sota that tells us as follows. We know that if a man accuses his wife of adultery, she has to go do the Sota process. Let's say the husband dies before his wife gets a chance to drink the water. She wants to collect her ksuva. Well, if she's committed adultery, she's forfeited the ksuva. And we don't know, because she hasn't yet drunk the water. So Beis Shammai omrim no los ksuvasan ve'enon shosos. Beis Shammai say that she's entitled to collect her ksuva. There's an assumption of her rights to the ksuva, that she's entitled to it, and there she doesn't have to drink. Ubeis Hillel omrim o shosos o lo no los ksuvasan. And Beis Hillel say nothing doing. Either drink or you don't get your ksuva. So the Gemara's question is, wait a minute, O shosos, how can you tell me that Beis Hillel advocate her drinking after her husband has died? Vehevi ha'ish es ishto amar rachmana v'leka. After all, the Torah says that a man has to bring his wife to drink. If the man's not there anymore, then she can't drink. So Ella mitoch shalosh shosos lo not los ksuvasim. But rather what Beis Hillel mean is, because she cannot drink, she doesn't have dibs on the ksuva, because there's no way to prove that she's entitled to the ksuva. V'hahacha the safek hu safek zanai safek lo zanai yukasi safek umotzi midei vadai. Now, how can it be from this case also? You also have the same question. If according to Beis Shammai ain't safek motzi midei vadai, how can this woman who's only a safek whether she's entitled to her ksuva come and collect? So elishmami nashtar ha'omed lagabos kegavui dami. So you see very clearly from here that a shtar, because she has this promissory note, which is her ksuva, that's what a ksuva is. A ksuva is a promissory note. It's a debt of it's a writ of collection, right? And therefore, it's because she's holding on to it, it's as if she's already collected from the estate. She's now the possessor as much as the other heirs are of her deceased husband, and therefore that's what gives her the right. And therefore, you're right, ein safek motzi midei vadai, but a person who holds a promissory note is like a vadai. And therefore, both in the case of the house that collapses and in the case of the sota, the person who's the creditor has the rights of collection. Now, ve'abaya lo sve meha. So the question is, when Abaya was challenging this premise that Beis Shammai hold ein safek motzi midei vadai, why did he challenge first from the case of the collapsing house and not challenge from the case of sota? I mean, after all, sota is a much more related case because we're talking about marriage over here. So the Gemara answers that Dilma ksuvas isha shayni mishum china. The answer is because maybe a woman's ksuva, you could have argued, is different. Now, what do we mean by that? There's this principle called china. China means comeliness or favor. And what does this have to do with the ksuva? One, we're going to learn, when we learn Maseches Ksuvas, that Chazal were brilliant in their institution of the ksuva. There were a lot of reasons why Chazal instituted the ksuva in order to preserve the integrity of a Jewish marriage. But one of the reasons is to provide a sense of reassurance and security to a Jewish woman. We want her to feel like she's secure in the marriage, and that she's not always going to feel like she's teetering on the brink of financial disaster, because her husband could divorce her at any time. And therefore, there are certain mechanisms that are instituted in the ksuva. And because of this, we want to give her that reassurance. You might have argued, says Abaya, that a ksuva is even stronger than a normal promissory note. A ksuva is so strong that even though a regular promissory note does not have the power of a vadai, but a ksuva promissory note does have the power to make her a vadai as if it's already collected. And therefore Abaya wanted to ask an even stronger question. What about a regular creditor who comes along and says that the son died with assets and it's only a safek? We still give him, treat him as a vadai because he's got that promissory note. But now the Gemara says, okay, fine, I understand why Abai asked the question from the collapsing house versus the case of the ksuva. But velos fe ksuva de masnisin. But what about the fact you're telling me that according to Beis Shammai, ein safek motzi midei vadai, and you challenged him from the case of the collapsing house? You could have chosen a case from our Mishnah itself. Because later on, our Mishnah says that when she dies, and it comes to a question of what's going to happen to the ksuva itself, we had said that according to Beis Shammai, the Shimon gets half of the ksuva, and her heirs get half of the ksuva. Now, the question, like Rashi explains, he says, "The Amri Beis Shammai yachloku, the kasal gadaita chashed the Beis Shammai nami yaksuv Amri yachloku kasi yorshin di dami safik v'gavu pala the ksuv and the yavam dahavi vadai." Now, in the case of the ksuva, the yavam is a vadai. We know he for sure is standing to inherit from his deceased brother, including the value of the ksuva. So, if that's the case, could you just close the door, please? If that's the case, then here too, the Mishnah itself is an indication that Safek is Motzi Midei Vadai according to Beis Shammai. Why would her heirs have any dibs on the ksuva if once she's dead? They don't have a for sure stake on the ksuva which is coming from her from Shimon's family estate. Why do you allow them? You should have asked from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah seems to indicate that according to Beis Shammai, Safek is Motzi Midei Vadai. That her family gets to have half of the ksuva, which is clearly from Shimon's family. Shimon is a Vadai stakeholder in his family's assets, including the value of the ksuva from his brother's estate. And her heirs are only a Safek, that they don't have that stronghold on the estate, and yet you're saying that because of that pseudo zika, that's really a marriage, but it's not a marriage, they're going to be able to take away half of the ksuva from Shimon. So therefore you see that Beis Shammai holds Safek Motzi Midei Vadai. That you should ask the question directly from our Mishnah, instead of asking it from other cases. So the Gemara says, Lo pligi. You misinterpreted the Mishnah. Beis Shammai acknowledges that when it comes to the value of the ksuva, that she was entitled to, the 200 zuz that she was going to take from the ksuva from her marriage to Ruvain, Shimon gets that 100%. But the Mishnah doesn't say that. So the Gemara says, "V'haketani meisa mayasa b'ksuvasa u'v'nechasim hanichnasim v'yotzim ima Beis Shammai omrim yachloku yorshe b'alam yorshe ha'abu Beis Hillel omrim nechasim b'chezkasan." But the Mishnah says explicitly that what do you do with both the Kesuva and her own real estate holdings? Beis Shammai say you split it equally. So how can you tell me that according to the Mishnah, Beis Shammai holds she gets everything? I mean, he gets everything, that Shimon gets everything. The Gemara answer is Hachi Ka'amar. You have to read the Mishnah as follows. This really takes a lot of creative reading. Mesa, that if she dies, Ma Ya'asa Biksuvasa Vishavka. The Mishnah asks, what happens to her ksuva? And then the Mishnah, you'd put in the words, ... You put in that in the Mishnah. In other words, ... which means, we'll come back to that. We're going to leave that question alone of what happens to her ksuva. And we're only going to address the next issue, which is nechasim hanichnasim v'hayotzim ima. As far as the assets, the real estate holdings that she brought into the marriage with her, that's the only point where Beis Shammai say, Beis Shammai omrim yachloku yorshei habalim yorshei ha'av, u'Beis Hillel omrim nechasim v'chezkasim. That's where Beis Shammai say they split, and Beis Hillel say you put everything on its chazaka, and therefore her heirs get everything from the real estate holdings. Amar Rav Ashi, and we'll just conclude with this. Rav Ashi says, Masnisa namidika. We have an inference from the Mishnah itself that the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is only going on her real estate holdings and not going on the ksuva. How do you see that? Diketani yachloku yorshei habalim yorshei ha'av velo ketani yorshei ha'avim yorshei habal shmamina. Because let's look at the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that the heirs of Reuven's family, meaning Shimon and his family, they divide together with the widow's family, which implies that the widow, we're talking about assets where there's an assumption of ownership by the widow's family, her mishpacha. Therefore, the chiddush is that Beis Shammai say that Shimon's family divides together with her family, which means that we're addressing holdings from her family. And it doesn't say the opposite, that when it comes to the ksuva, we would say, since it really is coming from Reuven and Shimon's family, her relatives divide with Shimon's family. It doesn't say that. It just says Shimon divides with her family, which implies we're only dealing with holdings from her estate, not dealing with holdings from the decedent's estate. And therefore, Shmamina, you see from here that the only point of machlokes is regarding what? Is regarding her real estate holdings, which are coming from her family. And really, the Gemara Rabbi is defending his position, and he's saying that according to the way I'm learning, Beis Shammai agrees, Ein safek motzi midei vadai, that if you only have a safek claim, you cannot extract from a vadai, and that's why when there's only a zika, which is only a pseudo marriage, it's like a safek, therefore she can completely control her holdings. Once she dies, however, therefore all bets are off. There's no muchzak anymore. There's no one who has a vadai claim to her assets, and therefore when it comes to the ksuva, Shimon is a vadai and he gets the whole ksuva. But when it comes to her real estate holdings, where there's no title holder that's alive anymore, Shimon gets half, and her heirs from her family get half. And we'll hold it here for today.